Sumaila, the honor is mine, and I'm really delighted to be giving this talk. It's the first time that I'm talking to an audience in Pakistan, but I do want to say that as humans, we have much more in common than what divides us, and I think that's um, far more true of India and Pakistan. So as a people, we have a very common culture, and growing up in India, I always found, even when I traveled abroad, that some of my closest friends were Pakistanis or from this part of the world. And I think that this kind of familiarity is important also because it shows that our cultural conditions and our problems today also have a lot in common with them. And so today, what I'm hoping to do is to show you some of the work of my practice. I started almost 20 years back as an architect in India. After that, I've been in the United States for many years now. And I have been teaching, I have been practicing, and of late, my practice has also moved towards a more projective, more speculative side of practice. And I will be sharing some of that work with you as well. So Sumar, I just want to ask you if I'm coming through all right, if you can see my screen, my video. Somehow I am not able to see my video.
Yes, we can see
but,
we can see you as well, and we can see your screen as well, and we hear
you great.
Also.
Perfect, fantastic. So I want to start with an observation that in a world that is increasingly characterized by niche specializations, architecture remains one of the last of the great generalist professions. As architects, we operate across territories, material, formal, technological, political, and social. And yet this very generalism, this very aspect of architecture that is so incredible and rich and allows us to practice across so many territories, this very generalism also produces a schism akin to Bruno Latour's double-headed man. And so in his book, Science in Action, the mind is divided between reason and scientific positivism on the one hand, and an insecure scientific curiosity on the other. So bringing this schism to an architectural territory, Lydia Kalipalidi in her Eco-Redux Manifesto, and this is quite known, there was a recent AD piece on this, considers the interior of the architectural discourse a position that rallies for logic specific to the core of the discipline. So autonomy, formalism, tectonic language, and syntax. And I have to say that as someone who enjoys teaching architecture core design studios, this is and should remain a contested question. You know, what is the core of our discipline? What do we teach when we teach design studio the very first year? What is that core? And then on the exterior, we identify with a position that rallies for a cause connected with the outside world. So social reform, environmental improvement, and political effect. And for decades, the architect has been double-faced, residing on either side of this schism. And now, more than ever, the architect can no longer operate on either side of the schism, but must deploy tools on both ends toward an architecture of agency. And I think growing up in India had a lot to do with this idea that architecture has to sort of synthesize both these ends and operate across territories. And so I insist that I can be a formalist and an activist, and I do not see a kind of a schism. In fact, I think my activism becomes better with formalism and beauty, and my formalism becomes better with a lot of activism. So I think that these things complement one another, and they shouldn't be this schism is a false schism. So this talk is structured around a few themes that have preoccupied my professional and teaching career. The themes are fluid, discursive, evolving, and reference one or more projects. Some projects overlap across themes, and in a few of the latter projects, like I said, I hope to show you how these themes can operationally fuse to generate tactics for an architecture of agency, or as I like to borrow from Lydia Kalipalidi, no more schisms. All of the built work in India that I will be showing today is through the collaborative effort with Riaz Tayyabji and the firm Antel Design, which I co-founded with him and Roma Pandya. And we've been collaborating since 2002. If I slip at times, and if I say I always mean we. And of course, even in my own independent practice based here in the US, if I say I mean we, because one always works with collaborators, designers, students of all the time. One other quick side note is that during the course of this talk, in your webinar, there is a Q&A. You should be able to see a little blurb that says Q&A. And please add questions as the talk goes along. And at the end of the talk, I'm sure there will be time. And in fact, I very much look forward to a conversation with you. So please do keep the questions coming in the Q&A. And so I start with the very beginning, the first of these themes, subtraction. And subtraction is perhaps the first and the primal, is really a primal act of architecture. It is the enabler of mass and void, of object and space, of poche and light. And this is the great Kailash Nath temple at Ellora, which was built from top down, carving 200,000 tons of stone, built in the 8th century. And it was completed in less than 20 years with very little margin for error, because when you subtract, it's different from an additive process. And so the scope for error is much less. But I find these plans and these sections absolutely fascinating and becoming of a primordial act of architecture, almost the kind of, it relates so much to humans and the cave and the grotto, which has always been somehow living in this hybrid condition between landscape and architecture. But here you begin to break out of that and you start seeing it as architecture. Or in the step wells of India, which have existed, the thousands of step wells that have been dotted across the Indian arid landscape. And these were also acts of subtraction. They were built from top down and their foundations built last. These were places for public gatherings, and they offered also respite to weary travelers. And even today, they serve as spaces for festivals and spaces of gathering, and they're gaining sort of more prominence nowadays. And I come here to this Islamic miniature painting, which shows that they were also feminine spaces where women gathered for rituals of the everyday, for bathing and the collection of water, like in this miniature from the 18th century. And speaking of architectural representations and miniatures, I'm going to make a little detour here from subtraction and talk about these miniatures, which have totally fascinated me. This is from a late 16th century manuscript of a Persian Ramayana owned by Hamida Banu Begum, the mother of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. I'm fascinated by the multiplicity of life depicted in these representations. The synanthropism, that is the coexistence, the symbiosis between reptiles, mammals, birds, fish, and other critters and humans, with a bit of architecture in the background. So this is, again, a 16th century illustration of a quintessentially Hindu epic, the Ramayana, now told through the medium of Islamic miniatures. And so therefore, I really am amazed by the kind of multivalent power, the capacity of architectural representations to do so many things, to pull so many strands together in one drawing. And this is so different from our modern means of representation, where we don't draw critters and we don't draw this kind of bounty of green life that is really a symbiotic relationship to the human. And the human obviously cannot exist without it. So it's not just representation, it's also depicting a view of the world that is synanthropic, and I will come to that later on in the talk. But back to subtraction. So this is a project that we did for an artist friend, one of the earliest projects I worked on, if not the first project I worked on, in fact. And it remains unpublished and somehow also remains close to my heart. We had what was perhaps a very challenging, even a schizophrenic brief. And the brief was to create a space for gathering, a party space, a place where you can have a lot of people. And then the schizophrenic, the other side of it was that it would be a place of solitude and a place of contemplation, an artist studio. And we had very little money. If you convert it to, it was $20,000, about 15 lakhs in Indian currency in 2003. So really very little amount of money. And so we decided to, because we didn't have a lot of budget, we said, let's locate the building at the seam condition here between these two parcels of land. And let's somehow build through subtraction, because labor being cheap, it allows us to sort of to remove earth from one side and then create this big berm. And as you can see from the sketch, the goal was to sort of make the berm part of the roof, and therefore get a kind of large open space on the top, and this kind of carved condition below, which would be the space for solitude. So here we have it. You get the large mound, which was created as a result of excavating this earth. And one of the things that we found really important was that we've only got 12 meters by 8 meters here. So it's a very, very small building. And in order to make the building feel like it belongs to a larger parcel of land, we thought it was really important to create multiple myriad ways of traversing and moving through the site. So you kind of come down here and you can go further down into this kind of sculpture pit, but you can also continue and walk in to the entrance from here. I hope you can see my red cursor here on the screen. And you can also see that you can go up these steps and up back to the terrace here. So really creating these myriad ways of walking through the site was really important to us. So there you go, you're coming down as you enter into this, again, kind of cave-like architecture on the one hand, which works with this notion of subtraction. looking back to where you come from, and the studio, the space of solitude opening up around the corner. Again, a really simple palette of materials. This is a cement floor with a little bit of stone in here, polished, but for the most part, it is a cement, red cement floor. And then meeting the terrace, the steps coming down from the terrace, and the sculpture pit. This was a picture taken not too long back, and I was happy to see that other than the purple, not a lot has changed, and the greenery has really sort of taken over and become one with the site, and that was quite gratifying. And I always show images of these buildings under construction because in a strange way, I think that they reveal a lot about the process, but also about a kind of larger condition, the condition of, for example, daily wage laborers. And as a young architect, in my early 20s, as I was standing on site, you kind of feel, of course, you know that this is a condition that exists all over the developing world, but when it happens on your own site, you sort of feel a kind of greater sense of responsibility. It's sort of closer to you. It's in your skin, and I sort of came to site, and I'm seeing these hutments, and these forms of architecture. I mean, this is also architecture right here, in a way, perhaps even something that we've not been able to address enough, and I will talk about this when I talk about the urban informal, because this sort of left a kind of impression with me, and I didn't know what to do with it at this time, but later on in my career I have tried in various ways to talk about, learn from, and address this kind of, you can call it poverty, which it is, but also a certain kind of urban informality, and more about that soon. So the budget being $20,000, if you imagine the construction, the daily wage laborer gets about $1.50 a day, and also women get less money than for doing the exact same work than their male counterparts, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's similar in Pakistan. So there you go, the brick buildings coming up, the mound to the left coming up, this large retaining wall that kind of retains all that earth. And then, my friends in the US are always amazed that you get kids on site. Of course, there's no, daycare for these children. And the scaffold and the little bars on the windows become the playground. So another project, this one in Udaipur, on a parcel of land to the right here, which is considered to be, barren land. Not much can happen there. And so here we were commissioned to build a house, but now it's being used for all kinds of other things as well. But the point here is you get this tremendous landscape, and to address this landscape, you want to be up on the ridge. And again, we use subtraction to sort of carve things out of the rock, and even make forms that relate to the rock and belong to this kind of ridge condition of the hill, which is up here, and the hill continues also on the other side. So this is the ridge of the hill. And so you kind of drive down here and you arrive at this place, And I will talk soon about the fact that we just didn't have the budget or the space to build a road, because the road would have kind of consumed both budget and space. And so we kind of devised another way of going up here. But as far as subtraction goes, there you go. The house kind of sits nestled into the landscape here. And you can really see it in the plan where this aspect of carving the rock is really important to us. And for the most part, we try to use as much of the rock we can in landscape and the surrounds. So again, working with this idea of cut and fill. And you can also see that in this kind of rocky outcrop, that the forms of the building have also been inspired by this aspect of the cut of the rock. So that's the living room on the lower level with these panoramic views, and then the bedrooms above. And then we've kept this aspect of subtraction in the building. Of course, you see this in many projects around the world. Frank Lloyd Wright does it in Falling Water to perhaps a lesser degree. But this idea that the rock doesn't have to be completely finished when it's inside the house. This is a local technique called chiri ki chinai. And what happens here is that you get this sort of dry masonry that covers the wet construction. So you kind of get really a mortarless finish. And somehow this aspect of building by hand again is very, very important and precious, and I think worth celebrating in our buildings. So the second of these themes is something you're probably very familiar with, this aspect of jugaad or jugaad, which is really frugal innovation, a design hack using clever improvisation. And so here you go, you have a washing machine converted into a lassi maker. Or you have, I don't know the person who did this, but this incredible light sculpture designed out of plastic bottles. Or you have this shop that gets popped up very quickly because the backdrop of the truck can be used. I mean, you see this, of course, all over the subcontinent, in Pakistan, in India, all over the world, actually, where resources are limited and people improvise on a daily basis. And there's something to be learned from this. And so this aspect has also fascinated us, and we've not known exactly how it builds into our work, but sometimes it just happens because you are in such a situation. But I want to digress a little bit, because when I got this image of this truck, I couldn't help but think also of the amazing artwork that you have with trucks in Pakistan. And this is not, I distinguish here between the notion of jugaad and this craft, this idea of painting these trucks. And I found it again, weirdly enough, at the Oslo Triennale, where they were talking about degrowth and this idea that somehow industrial efficiencies have produced only a singular way of thinking about things. So for example, we only think about trucks as ways of efficiently moving goods from A to B. But what if trucks are, like they are in Pakistan, homes for people? And so then they become a whole practice in and of themselves. And they have so much more to offer suddenly than this kind of cold, industrial, efficient rhetoric. And so this is against, degrowth sort of privileges this idea that somehow we have created a highly, almost too efficient world, and we need to remove things from the growth system, from the idea of GDP, from the idea of constant accumulation of capital. And so degrowth emphasizes removing things out of the capitalist economy. So even at the risk of a little bit of, because once you add all of these accoutrements and ornaments, obviously the fuel efficiency of the truck comes down, but it gives you so much more. So this idea that efficacy and not efficiency is something we should celebrate. And the efficacy means that there is a sense of joy, a sense of belonging. It's a practice that promotes crafts, it tells stories. There is so much more going here than this kind of cold importance of efficiency. And so I digress here, but this is not so much about Jugaad, but I wanted to talk also about this notion of degrowth. That is a theme that I won't be talking about separately, but it is an important, and increasingly I am interested in this idea of how do you remove the notions of efficiency from the capitalist economy, and you make things that are not about growth alone, but are much more multivalent. So back to Jugaad, here is a friend of mine, Sanjeev Shankar, who designed this canopy, really, really incredible, out of cooking oil cans. And then coming back to our house in Udaipur, remember I told you there wasn't a way of climbing up this mountain. So we looked at mining equipment and we said, okay, there we can, of course, we can arrive and we can create a path to go up to this landscape. But you need wheelchair access, you need a kind of an inclined elevator. And of course, the easiest way to do an inclined elevator is to look at mining equipment. And so we looked at mining platforms that are very kind of robust and work on a single rail. And there you have it. This is a kind of a Jugaad, using a technology that exists to a completely different purpose. But in the process of doing this, we were able to build a very, very cheap moving elevator and activate the site without a very expensive road that would have not left any budget or any site for that matter. So Le Corbusier argues, the third of these themes, courtyards. Le Corbusier argues that orthogonality, the orthogonal state of mind, best represents the modern age and best represents the idea, again, of human efficiency. And he famously criticized Camillo Sitte, who talks about medieval cities. And he said, he called medieval cities the pack donkey's way. So man walks in a straight line because he has a goal and knows where he's going to, but the pack donkey meanders along, scatterbrained and distracted, and zigzags in order to avoid the large stones. And so somehow this idea of the zigzag, this idea of again, not the most efficient way of going from A to B, but of meandering, was very important to us, the pack donkey's way. And this is the old city of Ahmedabad with a series of courtyards that are connected through these loose pathways. And we love and cherish this kind of poche and this idea of light and void and this kind of loose movement between things. And I'm sure you also see it in old cities in Pakistan and all over the world. In fact, you find that old cities were always built in this kind of loose manner. And somehow courtyards were really important as places where you sort of paused and the street widened enough and you started calling it a courtyard, and same here. And then the same here. And somehow this stayed with us, and we didn't know how it works, but I think somewhere it comes into our buildings. And so this is a house we did in Bangalore, a lot of straight lines here, But look at the circulation, look at the pack donkeys where you kind of arrive, you come here and you see right through the house, but there's no way to go from A to B directly. You have to sort of meander loosely around these courtyards and come to the various spaces of the house. And this was important to us, this idea that the courtyards organize loosely the spaces between, and you don't have an architecture of walls, but you have an architecture of courtyards that separate a set of loosely connected spaces, and you meander and you almost have to walk diagonally sometimes across these spaces. And then the section works in tandem with the courtyard. So you get a covered courtyard here, an open courtyard here. So you get various gradations of light as you arrive and experience this building. And of course, the roof also responds to conditions of light. And there you go. You kind of understand the courtyard here, the covered courtyard. There's a courtyard on this side, which is the open to sky courtyard. You arrive somewhere here and you kind of meander through, almost walking in this diagonal fashion. There you go. You start seeing again the courtyards, one against the other here, stacked up, but you cannot walk along this way. Also, this idea of a half level becomes important because we are interested in obliterating, or as much as possible, working against this notion of a fixed datum. And images of the project under construction. Another house, and here we had to contend with a driveway. So here you sort of have to drive and park, but we thought, what if the driveway sort of builds up a circular, a path of movement that is ever so slightly and gently curved, and that curve actually creates a slowness as you kind of walk into this thing. So this idea of even a very gentle curve can actually affect the way in which you sort of experience this thing. Of course, the curve also allows us to create and focus upon this garden here, and the whole house kind of is these two bars that are separated by this kind of void space in the middle, courtyard here in the beginning as you kind of come in, and then at the end where things kind of open up to the trees in the landscape here. The upper level, and then the roof again. And so here's that entrance sequence that I was talking about with the curved wall to the right. You start seeing the curve build up, and then the staircase somehow also develops that connection. And we studied this space across different times of the day. And we were, most of our heat gain is in Ahmedabad. It is from the roof because the sun is beating overhead for most of the day. And so we wanted to study how light affects this in the mornings and the evenings, and actually keeps the sun out for the day. So this would be a kind of winter evening sun. The house as it stands before COVID created a big pause in everything. But these are images from December. This is as you kind of come, just a few screenshots, but as you come to the other end, and this is it under construction, also from December. The place of arrival. And then because we get so much heat gain from the roof becomes, we use these pots to create insulation. So it's a double concrete with these pots in the middle. You get a very thin slab of concrete on above this. So this was from very recently, just before construction came to a halt. So the fourth theme, ornament. Before ornament became crime, as it famously did with Adolf Loos's Ornament is Crime, before ornament became crime, it went through a process of becoming extraneous. Alberti considered ornament as a form of auxiliary light, a complement to beauty. Beauty is the inherent property to be suffused all through the body, whereas ornament, rather than being inherent, has the character of something that is attached or additional or tacked on. And so before Lowe's and early modernism makes it a crime, Alberti makes it extraneous or something that is tacked on. But what if ornament was never tacked on? What if ornament was always intrinsic and not extraneous? And what if it served a function, like in this Haveli, where it creates shadows and cuts glares and even becomes, offers places for these pigeons to sit on, so it allows for a certain kind of life. And what if ornament was also a ventilation screen, like in this, this is the Mosque of Sidi Sayed, also in Ahmedabad, one of the earliest monuments in Ahmedabad, and actually pretty close to my place of birth in Ahmedabad, in the old city. And so here what I find really incredible is this inversion between figure and solid, and then something that is immaterial and really light. And this inversion is, again, something that is one of the affects that ornament allows for. Or what if the ornament was an enabler of long-held craft traditions, like with, again, these incredibly ornate pole houses also in Ahmedabad? Or what if ornament was a place of refuge for birds and cows, and like in the case of these bird feeders? And on the right, you have this bird feeder here at the Juma Masjid in Ahmedabad, the largest public gathering space, of course, in the old city. And so I think that these are great sort of examples of this idea, again, of synanthropism, that we create architectures not just for ourselves, but also for a kind of coexistence of all forms of life. And I think we have to increasingly think like this if we have to address our current crises of ecology and climate change, that we have for too long privileged industrial efficiencies, and we need to privilege a kind of efficacy. Or what if ornament was this capacity for the form to completely pixelate, like in the Meenakshi temple at Madurai, where you see a monolith on the left, but as you come closer, the monolith completely pixelates. And so this is a project that I will talk about in a little bit more detail, but here we have these courtyards, and we said, what if we take these courtyards, this is a school, and we made these courtyards part of these large textiles inspired by African traditions. This is in Africa, in Malawi, and we use them on the courtyard. I'm going to go a little faster because I see I'm really behind time now. So you get this ornament taken from the textiles that becomes part of this process of painting these walls again and again with the students there. Or in this house, in this graphic design studio we did, where ornament becomes a rain screen, but it also allows for crafts to be developed. So I want to talk a little bit about agency, and what do I mean by agency? And agency here is architecture's own capacity to enact change. And agency here exists, the way I think of it and talk of it, it exists across both ends of this spectrum. It exists as the formal tectonic spatial quality of architecture that beauty inherently has, or this kind of architectural rigor and discipline inherently have in them the capacity for people to take pride in what is built. but also architecture can directly address, like I have been talking about, broader social, ecological, and political questions. And therefore, in doing so, agency allows us, in the face of all pervasive ecological, political crises, agency allows us to rescue architecture from its own inwardness and obsolescence through means, methods, manifestos, devices, sites, and forms that embrace an architecture of radical engagement. This destabilizes traditional binaries between autonomy and engagement, building and city, public and private, author and agent, project and practice, the canon and its alternative. And so I am interested in destabilizing these very kind of staid and old established binaries. So no more schisms. So here you go. The urban informal is really what our cities are made up of. In the urban economy in India, if you don't count the agricultural sector, is something like 80% of all employed people work in this kind of urban informal economy. So I took this picture. So I studied urban informality in Latin America, and I took this picture sometime in 2013. But actually, it's not one picture; it's two pictures. One to the left from the Previ Lima housing project, very famous, designed by very famous architects. And then this was Via El Salvador on the right, which is essentially a community that comes out of nothing, a just self-built community. So on the left you have all of these very famous architects that were invited to do the very landmark Previ housing competition. And this is really one of the last great socialist housing competitions that we've had. It's like inviting some of the most famous architects in the world. Look at these names today to do social housing in a corner of the developing world, So this was built with a lot of acclaim, that is Previ. And on the right we have Via El Salvador, which was people just building with whatever scraps that they could afford. And I studied 4 such settlements. So to contrast this distinction between where architects are involved, and architects are even given the brief, like in Aranya with B.V. Doshi's project in Indore, or Previ housing that I just showed. Architects were given the brief to think incrementally and to design low cost. And here you just got people sort of building in this kind of bottom-up way. And what is interesting is that over time, there is not that much difference between these settlements. And so the vernacular ordinary, the default method of building the urban informal, has been employed to make all sorts of additions and alterations. It is intriguing to me that the informal and incremental self-help model of post-occupancy construction remains the same. So in spite of architects like in Previ, devising all various different ways of building it, these norms were not always followed, many times because they were too technologically advanced. They were perhaps not efficacious enough. They privileged efficiencies. They didn't allow for a multivalent way of building this thing. And so this is Rio, and I do not see this as a slum or as a favela or as blight, but I think that there is something to be learned from this city, which is constantly under construction, the city which is really built with as little possible, but it's not efficient, it's efficacious. And I like that capacity very much. And when you understand that 3% of our cities are built by architects, I think we are forced to look at this. We have to address this, and we have to ask ourselves, how does architectural agency start addressing and questioning and learning from these landscapes? Another view of the map of the world which shows the proportion of people living on less than or equal to $2 of purchasing power parity in 2016. So what is really interesting is that this urban informal is 1 in 3 people in living in the world today. But look at this. By 2050, the urban informal population will become 3 billion people. But at the same time, the number of poor people is slated to decline. And this has been happening for a while now, that absolute poverty is actually shrinking. But with the shrinkage of absolute poverty, because of neoliberalism, because the government doesn't want, I mean, traditionally, we've not had, governments that have privileged social infrastructures. And so urban informality is likely to increase even as global poverty decreases. And so we find that the question I'm asking myself is, what if we took like this idea of this staid, very, very, very pristine architectural object and infused it with some of the lessons of the urban informal, this idea that the city is always under construction, this aspect of incrementality. What do we get? Can we learn from this practice as architects? And so this is a project we did for a graphic design studio in Ahmedabad. Again, this is the parcel of land, the plot, and then this was the addition. But what was nice for us was that the brief said that we don't know when or for what purpose, but we know that we will need to increase this house. We will need to incrementally build this house. And it immediately, we realized that this is an opportunity to think about incrementality in architecture, right? So not so much as a sort of direct solution for the favelas or the slums, but more as, can architecture learn from this notion of incremental growth? And so this is the project. It's an exoskeleton with very, very thin steel columns. The columns are 33 by 66 millimeters, so really thin columns. It's an exoskeleton by day and by night. Because there's so much greenery around it, we could get away with so much glass. And then from the inside, there are skylights above, and these skylights can offer then places eventually for staircases and things like that when this house, when this studio can be extended. And so again, it's a very, very small parcel of land and a very small building, and then the building under construction. Contractors and steel fabricators operating at this domestic scale inevitably use the default practices of in situ on-site construction, where steel is measured, cut, welded, and finished on site. And hence, as architects, we do not consider these orders to be as distinct as they appear to be, but in fact celebrate the customizable, again, hand-built quality of these architectures. And so here we developed a whole range of structurally viable possibilities, because all we had was this kind of this idea that the building will grow over time. And we said, what if we took like very kind of formal architectural protocols, stacking, stretching, sloping, stepping, and started designing ways and possible menus for the future growth of this building. And then we also did that at the scale of, we thought of this temporally at the scale of the building itself. So somehow 15, the envelope and the structure and the rain screen all have different years of lifespan. So within the same building, you can have, again, a kind of incremental logic. Obviously, in the history of architecture, there's a lot of precedence to this. This is Archigram's plug-in city, where again, this notion of expendability is and temporality is built into the city. And so here we see the house, the studio as it stands, and then the capacity for it to grow over time. So this is just one of the larger menus for the way in which this can grow. So Sumaira, just to, if you're listening in, and for maybe everyone, this is going to be, I've got two more tactics coming up. So
Yeah, I
maybe
think that's
another
fine.
15, 20 minutes and we'll be done.
Sounds good.
So food. This is a project in the remote part of Malawi, and I want to show here this building, which is really the failure of architecture, in my opinion, because this is a part of the world that has no water, no electricity, no sewage. And it has this architecture, and people cannot use it because it's dark, because there's no electricity. And of course, you shouldn't be using light during the day. And so students actually have to sit out because the windows are so small, because the building just doesn't allow for daylight. And so I worked on this project with someone who actually, Auburn Siddle, who actually ran a school in Malawi for a long time, and with some really talented students at Cornell. And we said, this is our site. This is the institution that was sponsoring this school edition, but this is really one of the poorest parts of Africa. And we said, what if we took that building that we just saw, that's not working, and the normative school type, but we flipped the roofs to get sunlight and ventilation, and collect rainwater. So you get these rainwater harvesting tanks, and you break it apart to get a courtyard between them, and then you extend the roofs to get some shade, and you add a ventilated pit latrine, and somehow you immediately get a tapestry, a kind of a typology that looks a little more viable. And you still build it with the materials that are available at hand. Aluminum roofing sheets are now quite the norm there. And here is the site. And this is something that was also interesting for us from an incremental standpoint, that, incrementality can also be at, and should be at, the level of the site where we can use a site and services approach inspired by B.V. Doshi's Aranya housing. So incrementally, you put in the buildings grow incrementally, but you put in all the infrastructure in the beginning, because that actually provides a kind of a jump start to the process. And we said, what if we did that with landscape as well? So the concept of the project is that students have lost, people have lost their relationship to food and to the ecology and the environment and the trees of the place. And so what if we created a place where the education was both in the classrooms, but very much also outside? So on the periphery here, we said we'll make them extensions of these fields. These are fields in the periphery. We extend them in. We plant things that are symbiotic and reciprocal to this cycle of farming. And then on the inside, we plant fruit trees in the courtyards for housing. We plant these large beds for edible roots, legumes, and smaller shrub-like growth. But all edible landscapes, essentially. And then the buildings really come all the way at the end. So you start getting the school coming up here, like I showed that tapestry, and you get the housing coming up around the courtyards. And you get this a set of techniques and technologies that can work with this landscape. So these are the beds I was talking about between classrooms. So somehow privileging the notion of an edible landscape and calibrating it very carefully with the architecture. The notion of ornament, and I spoke about this earlier. And this is some of the work I've been doing as part of the Richard Rogers Fellowship that I received from Harvard last year. And it deals directly with the question of food and architecture. And so I was really shocked to see this image. All the purple shows the the amount of agricultural land that is being devoted to feed and fuel. And increasingly, that is becoming the norm, even in the developing parts of the world, where we are growing things that are not going into human stomachs, but that are going to produce cattle feed and fuel. And you really understand that when you look at this, and you understand why beef is so ecologically unsustainable, because it has, if you put in 719 calories, you only get 21 calories in the end out of it as food. And so it really shows you how much our economies are constructed from a kind of cradle to grave situation, where we just waste a kind of large amounts of energy in producing small amounts of food. And this is in the United States. Chicken in the 1920s was pound for pound as expensive as lobster, but by the 1960s it was so cheap that it quickly was becoming America's most popular meat. And almost all of the chicken we eat today is a direct progeny of this Chicken for Tomorrow project. It not only had to be efficient, but it had to be a chicken with big breasts, light colored feathers, so that these could be plucked and they would look good under cellophane. Like, there was a whole design brief given to design the chicken of tomorrow. And the chicken we eat definitely in the US is a direct progeny of this very, very unsustainable way of industrial production of meat and agriculture. So because I was based in the UK, I was looking at all the food that the UK imports from all over the world, and the carbon footprint of food is, of course, immense. And again, like I said, with this notion of urban informality, as we start in India, in Pakistan, as we start becoming more and more, we aspire to, eating food and delicacies from all across the world. This is also going to be our future if we do not devise alternatives. And in the Western context, I can say for sure, and I also know from India that industrial production of food and industrial agricultural processes have created, vast amounts of ecological devastation. So demand for food in one part of the world indirectly stimulates the creation of fields of monoculture thousands of miles away, and unknown species of plant and animal are lost. Billions of trees vaporized into as many tons of greenhouse gases to satisfy our hunger. And this is a cycle that has been upsetting the hydrological cycle of the planet. And so I also looked at the opposite end of this spectrum, where, what are radical ways of growing food in London? And this is an underground bunker that was in the Second World War, now not utilized, but it is just been converted into a factory that produces food. They nearly have a carbon zero imprint. It's possible to do this because you're sitting under so much earth that you don't need to heat or cool these spaces at all. And so even in the winter, this has a stable temperature, and you're able to grow with hydroponics and very little water. You're able to grow herbs, and they're able to get electricity for really cheap because they use it in the night mainly, where they have a good deal with the City of London. This is a market that I was studying that's under construction by Maria Smith from the office in Ilford. And this is a market that actually will move, activating various parking lots. But what I find really interesting is that it not only is a circular way of producing food, because you grow food, you eat food, and then the biogas produces fertilizer that goes back into these things. But at the same time, fertilizer and energy. But at the same time, it's also a circular way of thinking about architecture, where the foundations are on the top of the sorry, you might have lost me there for a minute, but circularly you sort of build this up as a building over time. And so this is work under progress, speculation on how markets can offer incredible opportunities in the making of an inclusive commons for the future of our cities, one that is public, ecologically robust, a place which connects places for food growing, preparing, selling, and kinship through circular, symbiotic, even synanthropic alliances. And this brings us back to this image where I make the case that, you know, our future buildings and our future ecologies have to take into account not just humans, but also a whole range of life. I'm going to skip over this is some of the work my students did at Taliesin. I'm just going to skip over it. A project here for taking over a golf course site and using using building construction waste to actually create a landscape of food foraging. So these are both bird houses, places for critters, and sort of using building construction waste to actually not create a landfill, but another kind of ecology. And so the last of this, I'm really sorry, I've gone over time, but I'll try and keep this very, very quick. This is, again, going back to Corbusier's idea of the museum as a state container, his reaction to this idea that the museum was a state container of the arts. And so he proposed these buildings in 29 and 31, the Endless Museum. The Endless Museum ultimately got built. But when it was built, it was again this kind of static container. So the idea of the Endless Museum was that you would, as the museum was a spiral, it could grow over time, and as it grew over time, it became this repository of knowledge. These buildings were built by Corbusier. They are incredibly gorgeous, great works of art, but now they have also become these static containers where you know, we have lost also this reference that they are all essentially the same building. These are their plans. They are all on pilotis. They are all these kind of closed facades. And actually, Corbusier was so serious that they would grow that he actually specified that a mason would and a carpenter would live on the site, and they would build this thing in perpetuity. And now, you know, so many years later, we're finding that one of these buildings in Ahmedabad may be demolished because it is under pressure from all kinds of real estate lobbies. And then the one in Tokyo has become UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I find this really fascinating. These are essentially the same buildings, one of which will be demolished, one's a World Heritage Site. The site in Ahmedabad where he actually proposed that there should be a market, and this idea of a heart, which is very, again, very specific to our part of the world, where things are exhibited, displayed, sold, and produced all in the same place again. So as a provocation, I proposed that there be a pavilion that could actually be moved across these three sites, and in the process, it would rejuvenate these sites. It would also activate this collective idea that these were essentially a trilogy of buildings that can be regarded as a singularity. And then the fact that these museums arguably relate to one another more than their immediate sites becomes the point of departure for making a pavilion that connects them. The pavilion will literally be transported across the three sites and be reassembled each time in a ritual of making and unmaking, evoking a formative agenda of the Endless Museum. And so in the process, it can connect the arts and crafts of these various sites. Of course, in Japan with the Itse Shrine, and in India with the Kumbh Mela, we know, and also with Corbusier and the Esprit Nouveau pavilions, we know that the idea of temporality and the idea of this pop-up architecture is not new at all, either to these cultures or to modernism. And so here I kind of surmise that the frame for this pavilion can be inspired by the golden ratio, and then these infills. So these are the infills of the pavilion. The infills of the pavilion will be inspired by also the artifacts of the museums, and the crafts of these museums. So these infills have a kind of separate life of their own. They kind of come in. So these are the infills, the pavilion devices. They can kind of come into the pavilion. And so to the left, you have the golden ratio pavilion geometries. The right, you have the infills. And you kind of get this collage of the infills and the pavilion here. And here's the pavilion as it sort of moves across sites. And it can be built and unbuilt in this again and again. And I think in that is a kind of activation of various craft practices. So in Tokyo, here in Chandigarh, in Ahmedabad, and these are all various possible configurations for example, in this slide, the location of this building. These are multiple configurations for where it can sit in Chandigarh. And in the process, this becomes a kind of heart, activating these architectures and these sites. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went a little bit above time, but I'm very happy to take questions.
I think you have quite a few questions. So can you see the Q&A, or should I read them out loud?
Yeah, I can. I can see the questions. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you. So I'll just go from the beginning onwards. So Zara Hussain, what are your thoughts on the relationship between subtraction and the need of minimizing footprint? This is a great question. Yes, I think that minimizing footprint is really important, of course, but there are various footprints, right? So there is the carbon footprint, which is the actual amount of resources consumed. There's an ecological footprint, which is not just carbon, but we use all kinds of other resources as well. So there is that. And then there is the actual footprint of the built work of architecture. And I think subtraction is just a formal, I mean, the way in which I'm framing this talk is that the subtraction is just a formal device. So of course you can use it either towards an ecologically sustainable way of thinking, or it can, you know, every project that uses subtraction isn't ecological at all. So one has to mix these various ways of thinking together and find, and that's why I call it tactics, because I think tactics are an important way of synthesizing this way of thinking. So tactics operate from within the ground. Tactics are not overarching strategies of master planning, but tactics are of the here and the now. And so I think of subtraction as just a tactic, a way, a theme, a way in which you can do something. But yes, it has to be combined with various other ways of thinking, and not every project can work only through subtraction, but it's just a trope. So the second question, also from Zara Hussain, you mentioned Corbusier and his notion of orthogonality and industrialization. How do you see the formal future of architecture in terms of orthogonal forms and curvilinear? Is one preferable, or logical answer to another, or why? So no, I don't think that there is anything good or bad about orthogonality or about curvilinearity. You know, again, I obviously, as you saw in a lot of the plans, there's a lot of straight lines, there's a lot of orthogonality, but it was a critique of more of efficiency, like this idea that somehow the orthogonal is a result of connecting two dots, right? So as you go from A to B, a straight road, a straight way of going and our cities are much more, they're much more fluid. They are definitely not, the old cities are not orthogonal. And in that process is a discovery of light, of shade, of slowness, and also of chance encounter. And so that is incredibly diverse. That encompasses both formal questions of movement, but also social questions. And I was interested very much in the capacities of orthogonality or curvilinearity to address these aspects. So that's how I was looking at it, not in terms of formal questions alone, but this talks all about suggesting that there isn't, one should not have only a formal way of looking at something, or even only a social way of looking at something, but really what brings architecture, what makes architecture special is that we can sit and stitch these various things together. And so I have really, in my work and even in my teaching, I have tried really hard to be both an activist, like I said, and a formalist. Does that, am I coming through, Sumaila? Can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
So you have quite a few questions.
I very much welcome questions from you or dialogue.
No, I think the students have asked a lot of questions. So
all right, so we just keep going.
Go through
So
those.
then
Yep.
There's an anonymous question. With the future showing decrease in global poverty and increase in informal living, how do you think architecture as a profession that formalizes every space can progress and transform? I think that's an absolutely great question. And I think that's also a big question in our cultures of teaching architecture, right? So we always teach architecture, and architecture is inherently, I mean, it formalizes, but I think the capacity to keep things open-ended, right? And I think that's where the notion of incrementality, the idea that somehow you can build temporally over time, and by building over time, you actually allow for agency, you allow for people to plug in. Because, for example, in some of the housing projects, or even in the school that I showed, the fact that the buildings can happen over time means that, you know, with little increments of money, you can still keep building, and you don't have to build in an ad hoc way, but there's the kind of framework within which you can sort of build incrementally. And I think when we design, we should think about notions of temporality, incrementality, and also the agency of people. And of course, there's a lot of work done across the world. Architects have, again, from our parts of the world, we've asked this question, and there's a huge legacy to architecture, especially in the case of housing, looking at incremental thinking. So I think incrementality is one way of asking this question of form. But also there are various other things that we need to do when we think about the urban informal. And I also think that informality is not always a good thing. And again, I'm very careful of couching this as good or bad. I don't think it's about these binaries, but it's really about understanding what that practice is doing. And if it is something that we can celebrate, then I think institutionalizing it is not a bad thing always. So, you know, one of the things that I think, there are many problems with the way in which India has developed, but one of the things that I'm proud of is civic institutions, and the idea that we can, you know, outside of the government also create institutions that sometimes, Amul, I think, is an example of how cooperatives have come together, taking, you know, informal farmers together and making Amul dairy. So, you know, there's many ways. And so what is cooperative housing doing? And I think there are questions of institutionality that we can bring to the informal. So in the initial examples, sorry.
So no, I was just going to interrupt. Maybe we can you have some questions on Facebook also.
Oh, wow. Okay. You might have to read the Facebook question.
I'll read it out for you. So one we can take is, how do you see the present pandemic of COVID-19 will shape tomorrow's architecture and its teaching?
Okay, wow, an incredible question. For any of you who are listening and are interested, and I can share these with Somaila, there are some incredible talks going on right now all over the world um, about what this pandemic means, what this moment means, and about the fact that we really, and I believe that we really should use this as, if you look at the history of disasters, disasters have always been ways in which humanity has come out stronger. And I think that that has to happen in this case as well. Of course, after the war, you've got the United Nations. Every disaster has brought upon it something that has helped us, and has addressed larger questions of our society. And I think one of the things, I think the question was, what does it do to architecture? I don't know immediately, but I can definitely say that as architects, it again points to what I've been talking about through the course of this talk. It points to the need for generalist thinking. It points to the need for having people who can connect the dots. And I think as architects, we do a really great job of connecting the dots. And I think we should never lose this capacity. And that's why we are a generalist profession, and we should insist that this capacity of connecting the dots, of connecting informality with form, with structure, material, labor, but also ecology, is something we have. And so what does it do to health? What does this crisis do to questions of density? Because we've always celebrated density, and now suddenly we are finding that density is actually perhaps a problem. How do you do social distancing in slums? How do you do social distancing in extremely dense cities like Manhattan and New York? And so I think these are questions that are architectural, and we should also make them architectural, because and also at the same time we should relate to the larger context that these raise, related to health, but also economics and social security nets and so on. Do you want to pull up other questions on Facebook, or should I
No,
answer?
you can take more from here.
Okay, so let's see. So could you comment and expand on architectural practice as activism, and how your work and ideas explore that aspect of architecture? Yeah, this is an absolutely great question, Fatima Arbab. I absolutely I absolutely agree with you, and I think that activism shouldn't be taught as something that's outside there. That I think if we have to deal with climate change, if we have to deal with um, um, questions of income disparity, which are huge, we have to bring a sense of activism, even as teachers, even as professors, into the classroom. And so I do believe that your question is, how does it affect my practice as a teacher? It definitely, I think I see myself as almost, if I could say this, sitting in, from teaching at Yale, I see myself as an activist also in the teaching, because I think that it's important to tell students that no, architecture matters, and it has a large role to play in creating a better world. And so we cannot afford to sort of think of it as purely a formal question. At the same time, I absolutely insist it is a formal question, because we are trained. I mean, this is what we do to connect. You think about modernism, and you think that large questions of housing, large problems that were facing the post-war crises were solved both formally and socially, right? There is the kind of richness that architecture has. So this is a great question. So then Zoheb Zubi, hi Zoheb. So No question here. I really wanted to appreciate this presentation. Thank you. Your work is really inspirational, and I hope our students will continue to think. Oh, sorry, it's not a question, but thank you, Zohaib, for the comment. So Hamad Aniz, what are your thoughts on the multiplicity of species and harmony with ecology within existing dense urban fabrics from our part of the world? Fantastic question. This is a great question. So, you know, in the United States, this blew my mind when I found out about this. There is greater diversity, biodiversity, species diversity in Central Park than in the entire state of, you know, pick a rectangular state in the US. So Iowa or Nevada. And I don't have anything against these places, but, you know, monoculture and industrialization and this aspect of agriculture as singular, efficient, and highly polluting because of the amount of pesticides and fertilizer that it uses has reduced biodiversity in all these places. So I think it is important to, and increasingly you cannot think of a planet that has nature as something that's out there. And I think this is, you know, Timothy Morton, who has written the book Dark Ecology, and Donna Haraway, who has written about this idea of the Thulucene as against a kind of anthropocentric view of the world. There's increasingly an acknowledgement that humans have shaped the whole planet. We are controlling literally at this point, we are affecting the climate of the planet. So we can no longer think of nature as something out there. And so nature is in what we do. And we are, in a sense, nature. And I think those miniature paintings of the Islamic rendition of the Ramayana somehow show that we are and we can include all kinds of critters, all kinds of birds. And we have to think about our built environments not only from a human-centric standpoint. And by doing so, and through this aspect of symbiogenesis and symbiotics, we realize that we make better environments for ourselves when we do that. So thank you for the question. I think that's a great question. Azimullah.
I think Sarosh, we can take one more.
Okay, great. So I guess I'm going to choose which one then.
Yeah, the lucky winner.
Oh, well, they're all such great questions. I'll just pick one. So thank you for sharing your work. What are your thoughts on the multiplicity of species, human ecology? Oh, I went through this. How do you balance function with aesthetics as an architect? I think I spoke a lot about that. I don't think we should separate it into these binaries. And I'm increasingly having a problem with talking about the world in binaries, east and west. I think that's a false binary. You know, aesthetics and function. I think that Enlightenment created a lot of these binaries, and we have somehow inherited them. And you know, I think that as we break away from these binaries, we will find for ourselves that in aesthetics is a lot of function, and in actually making things functional, there is an aesthetics. So I would desist from the again, private and public. You know, I almost wish we made a list of all these binaries and talked about just ways in which we can break them, because I think that would offer a good way of thinking about our future. So with that, thank you very much. I really enjoy doing this, and thank you.
I want to thank you again for doing this so last minute. I think it's safe to say from all the comments that it's been a wonderful talk and very thought-provoking for all the students. I was going to say something myself, but I think Sami, who's one of our assistant professors, has said it really well. So I will just read that out loud. Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk. The interactions between the layers of formalism and activism were consistent throughout your work. In our context, it appears that these layers and interactions mainly reside and flourish within the academy. Outside of it, it is formalism that dominates, and notions of activism are more often than not deemed non-essential. Things need to change out there and fast. So That's not a question, but you can give your closing comments on it, and then we can.
No, thank you very much. I totally agree, and I think that the academy can be a place for things to begin, and should be. And I, in many ways, think it produces. I was looking at all this resistance in India that's happening to all kinds of very appalling politics, and I found that the academy is actually a place where these things start. And so, going back to even in the United States, looking at the academy has always been a place for social, political resistance, and also ways of imagining a new world. So it has to begin in schools. And so, again, thank you very much, Samaila, for the invitation. I'm thoroughly honored,
Yeah.
and have a great evening.
Yes, and hopefully once things get better, we can get you out to Pakistan in person, like we'd hope.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Take care, everyone.